Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation. And this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds, or thinks it finds, is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue. But Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change. They become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible-sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations. Narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen. And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress. Because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus? What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own state, but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you're anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding. And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange. Noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected. And Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, the critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, you do not know yourself, but I know you. And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust, tried to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains: how to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behaviour, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behaviour it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions and mental formations and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering: the dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, all he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution. And perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what it is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, And they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness. And so, self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behavior is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake. And this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption. And perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange. And that this dual nature is not a bug, but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself, even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself, and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception, but the rule, is not the deviation, but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually? inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so, the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations. New forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance, and the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function, and so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing. except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity. And the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity, and the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. Knowledge of death's timing changes everything, converts the abstract certainty into concrete countdown, transforms mortality from philosophical concept into calendar date, into the number of days remaining, into the tangible approaching of an endpoint that was always coming but was kept safely distant by uncertainty, by the not knowing that allowed life to proceed as if time were infinite, as if tomorrow were guaranteed, as if the future extended indefinitely, even though reason knows it does not, knows it cannot, knows that death is certain and that the certainty will arrive, but the arriving felt distant, felt abstract, felt like something that happens eventually, but not yet, not soon, not on a specific date that can be marked on calendars, that can be counted down to, that can be known in advance with accuracy that is not perfect but is close enough, is 96%, is the probability that the algorithm assigns after analysing the data, after processing the medical records, the genetic information, the lifestyle factors, the environmental exposures, the family history, the biomarkers, the patterns that correlate with longevity, with disease, with the failures that lead to death, and the failures are predictable, are following patterns that machine learning can detect, can model, can use to generate predictions that are accurate enough to be actionable, to be used by insurance companies, by employers, by governments, by anyone who has access to the data and the algorithms. And the access is spreading, is becoming easier, is approaching the point where anyone can know their death date, can receive the prediction, can see the number, can confront the countdown. And the confrontation is what changes everything, is what transforms life from open-ended to finite, from abstract mortality to concrete deadline, from the someday of death to the specific day, the specific year, the specific age at which the algorithm predicts the ending will come. And the coming is what becomes real, becomes present, becomes the fact that shapes every decision, every plan, every moment, because the moments are numbered, are limited, are approaching zero, and the zero is known, is visible, is the date that appears on the screen after the algorithm processes the data, after the calculation completes, after the probability is assigned, and the probability is high, is 96%, is accurate enough that insurance companies are using it, are adjusting premiums based on predicted death dates, are denying coverage to those whose dates are too near, are charging more to those whose dates reveal risk, reveal vulnerability, reveal the likelihood of claims, and the claims are what matter to insurers, are what drive the calculations, are what make death dates valuable information, are what justify the investment in algorithms, in data processing, in the machine learning systems that can predict mortality with accuracy that exceeds human intuition, that surpasses clinical judgment. That is better than what doctors can do, what actuaries can estimate, what anyone could know before the algorithms existed, and the existence is recent, is new, is the result of advances in computing, in data collection, in the availability of medical records, genetic sequences, lifestyle data, all the information that used to be scattered, that used to be private, that used to be inaccessible, but is now consolidated, is now analysed, is now feeding the algorithms that predict death dates. And the predictions are accurate, are reliable, are being used, are shaping decisions, are affecting lives, are creating the knowledge that was not available before, that humans did not have before, that changes what it means to be mortal, because mortality was always certain but was never scheduled, was never assigned a date, was never made concrete in the way that the algorithm makes it concrete, makes it specific, makes it countable. And the counting is what humans are doing, are responding to, are organising their lives around once they know, once they receive the prediction, Once they see the date, and the seeing changes everything, makes priorities shift, makes some things urgent and other things irrelevant, makes the future feel different, feel shorter, feel like it is running out. And the running out is literal, is measurable, is the countdown that starts the moment the date is known, the moment the algorithm delivers its prediction. And the prediction is usually not exact, is usually a range, is usually giving a year rather than a day, but the year is specific enough, is concrete enough, is making death real in a way it was not real before. And the reality is what some cannot bear, is what drives some to ignore the prediction, to refuse the knowledge, to not ask for the date, to not run the algorithm, to maintain the uncertainty that allows life to feel open-ended, that allows the illusion of infinite time. And the illusion is functional, is protective, is what most humans need in order to function, in order to plan, in order to invest in futures that might not arrive. And the arrival is what the algorithm predicts, is what it calculates, is what it makes known. And the known is both liberation and burden, is both the gift of clarity and the curse of certainty. Because certainty about death is not like certainty about other things, is not providing comfort, is not making life easier, is making life harder, is making every moment weighted, is making every choice consequential, is creating the pressure of the countdown, of the limited time, of the approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end point, is the date that the algorithm predicts. And the prediction is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping how people live. Once they know, once they receive the information, once they confront the countdown. And the confrontation is what matters, is what the algorithm creates, is the transformation of abstract mortality into concrete deadline. And the deadline is what changes behavior, is what makes some people quit their jobs, leave their marriages, pursue dreams they had deferred, make radical changes in the hope that the changes will alter the prediction, will push the date further away, will buy more time. And the time is what everyone wants, is what the algorithm quantifies, is what becomes precious once it is known to be limited. Once the limit is visible, once the countdown begins, and the beginning is the moment of knowing, is the moment the prediction is delivered, is the moment the algorithm completes its calculation and displays the date. And the date is sometimes soon, is sometimes far, is sometimes already past, and the past is the strangest case. Is the situation where the algorithm predicts a death date that has already occurred, that has already passed, and the passing means the prediction was wrong, means the person has outlived their calculated mortality, has survived beyond what the algorithm expected, and the expectation was based on data, was based on patterns, was based on probabilities that apply to populations, but not necessarily to individuals. And the individual is what matters, is what the algorithm is trying to predict. But individuals vary, individuals are unique, individuals do not always follow the patterns, and the patterns are statistical, are probabilistic, are accurate for groups, but not always for persons. And persons are what the algorithm is being applied to, is being used on, is generating predictions for, and the predictions are mostly accurate, are right 96% of the time. But the 4% is significant, is the margin where the algorithm fails, where the prediction is wrong, where people die earlier than predicted or survive longer than predicted. And the longer is what some experience, is what creates the strange situation of living past one's predicted death date, of waking up on the day after the day that was supposed to be the last day. And the last day was not the last, was not the ending, was just another day. And the day after is another day. And the days continue, and the continuation is confusing, is disorienting, is raising questions about what the prediction meant, about whether it was wrong, about whether the algorithm failed, or whether something changed, whether the person's condition improved, whether the factors that were feeding the prediction shifted, and the shifting is possible, is part of what makes the predictions not fixed, not absolute, not carved in stone but calculated from data that is current at the moment of calculation, but that changes, that evolves, that reflects conditions that can improve or deteriorate. And the improvement is what some people achieve, is what some people work toward, is the reason some people change their lifestyles. After receiving the prediction, after seeing the date, after confronting the countdown. And the countdown motivates, creates urgency, creates the pressure to change, to improve, to extend the time, to push the date further away. And the pushing is sometimes successful, is sometimes resulting in new predictions, in updated calculations, in revised death dates that are later than the original dates. And the later is what everyone wants, is what the changes are aiming for, is what makes people exercise, eat differently, reduce stress, stop smoking, address conditions that were being ignored, take medications that were being skipped, make appointments that were being postponed, all in the hope that the algorithm will notice, will incorporate the changes, will recalculate, will generate a new prediction with a later date. And the later is what some people achieve, is what some people see when they run the algorithm again, when they check the prediction, when they look for evidence that their efforts have mattered, have changed the trajectory, have bought time. And the time is what matters, is what the algorithm quantifies, is what becomes visible through the prediction. And the prediction is not destiny, is not fate, is not fixed, is probability, is likelihood, is the best estimate based on data. But estimates can be wrong. Data can change, probabilities can shift. And the shifting is what makes the algorithm dynamic, makes the predictions update, makes the death dates change. Sometimes moving closer, sometimes moving further, sometimes disappearing entirely when new data arrives, when conditions improve, when the patterns that were predicting early death are disrupted by interventions, by treatments, by changes that alter the trajectory. And the trajectory is what the algorithm models, is what it calculates, is what it uses to predict the future. And the future is uncertain, is probabilistic, is not determined, but is shaped by choices, by circumstances, by the countless factors that influence health, that affect longevity, that determine when death arrives. And the arriving is what the algorithm predicts, is what it calculates with 96% accuracy. But the accuracy is for populations, is statistical, is not guaranteed for individuals. And individuals are what matter, are who receive the predictions, are who live with the knowledge, are who face the countdown. And the countdown is real, is concrete, is making mortality tangible in a way it never was before. And the before was uncertainty, was the not knowing that allowed life to feel open-ended, that allowed plans to extend indefinitely, that allowed the future to seem guaranteed even though it was not, even though death was always certain, always approaching, always inevitable. And the inevitable is what the algorithm makes visible, makes specific, makes countable. And the counting is what changes everything, is what transforms life. Once the date is known, once the prediction is received, once the algorithm delivers its calculation, and the calculation is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping insurance, shaping employment, shaping medical care, shaping decisions about treatment, about intervention, about whether to invest in extending life, when the extension is predicted to be brief, when the algorithm says the time is short, when the date is near, and the near is what matters, is what determines coverage, determines access, determines whether resources are allocated, whether treatments are approved, whether hope is offered or withheld. And the withholding is what some fear, is what the algorithm enables, is the denial of care based on predicted death dates, based on the calculation that says the investment is not worth it, that the time remaining is too brief, that the return is insufficient, and the return is measured in life years, in quality-adjusted survival, in the metrics that reduce existence to numbers, to calculations, to the outputs of algorithms that predict mortality and that are used to decide who receives treatment and who does not, who gets coverage and who is denied, who is worth investing in and who is not. And the not worth is the judgment that the algorithm makes possible, is the decision that becomes justifiable when death dates are known, when predictions are reliable, when accuracy is 96% and the percent is high enough to be trusted, to be acted upon, to be used as basis for decisions that affect lives, that determine futures, that shape who survives and who does not. And the survival is what matters, is what everyone wants, is what the algorithm is supposedly helping by predicting, by warning, by providing information that can be used to intervene, to prevent, to extend life. But the extension is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring resources, requiring access, requiring the willingness to invest in futures that might be brief, that might not extend far beyond the predicted date. And the date is what hangs over everything, is what shapes decisions, is what makes some futures seem worth pursuing and others not. And the not worth is the category that some people are placed into once their death dates are known, once their predictions reveal short timelines, limited futures, approaching endpoints. And the endpoints are what the algorithm calculates, are what it makes visible, are what transform mortality from abstract to concrete, from someday to specific day, from uncertain to known. And the known is what changes everything, is. What makes death real is what creates the countdown, the pressure, the urgency, the weight of limited time. And the time is running out, is approaching zero, is moving toward the date that the algorithm predicted, and the prediction is accurate, is reliable, is right 96% of the time. And the time is what matters, is what is being counted, is what is being lost, is what is approaching exhaustion, and the exhaustion is death, is the end point, is the zero that the countdown reaches and the reaching is inevitable, is certain, is what the algorithm predicts, is what the calculation shows, is what the death date represents. And the representation is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping reality, is making mortality concrete, is transforming death from philosophical abstraction into calendar appointment, into the date that is marked, that is known, that is approaching, and the approaching is what matters, is what changes everything, is what makes the algorithm powerful, is what makes the prediction consequential, is what transforms knowledge of death date from curiosity into burden, from information into weight, from prediction into reality. And the reality is that death is approaching, is scheduled, is calculated, is known. And the knowing changes everything, makes every moment count, makes every decision matter, makes life feel urgent, finite, precious, limited. And the limited is what the algorithm reveals, is what the death date represents, is what 96% accuracy means, which is that the countdown is real, is reliable, is approaching the end, and the end is death. Is the date, is what the algorithm predicts, is what the calculation shows, is what some people know, is what some people live with, is what some people count down to. And the counting is real, is happening, is making mortality concrete, is transforming death from abstraction to appointment, from someday to specific day, from uncertain to known. And the known is the algorithm, is the prediction, is the death date that is calculated, that is displayed, that is accurate 96% of the time. And the time is running out, is approaching zero, is moving toward the date, and the date is death, is the end point, is what the algorithm predicts, is what some people know, is what changes everything, is the countdown, is the calculation, is the algorithm that predicts death date with 96% accuracy. And the accuracy is what matters, is what makes the prediction real, is what makes mortality concrete, is what makes death a date, a number, a countdown, and the countdown is happening, is real, is approaching zero, is moving toward death. And death is the algorithm, is the prediction, is the date that is known, that is calculated, that is approaching. And the approaching is certain, is reliable, is accurate 96% of the time, and the time is what remains, is what is counted, is what is running out. And the running out is death, is the date, is what the algorithm predicts, and the prediction is accurate, is real, is the countdown to death, to the end point, to the zero. And the zero is approaching, is certain, is the date that is known, that is calculated, that is predicted by the algorithm with 96% accuracy. And the accuracy is what makes it real, what makes it matter, what makes death a date. And the date is approaching, is certain, is the countdown, is the algorithm, is the prediction, is death. Privacy might be accident, might be the result of biological shielding rather than fundamental law, might be the consequence of frequencies that consciousness operates on being inaccessible to ordinary perception, but not inaccessible in principle, not impossible to detect, not inherently private, but only contingently private, only hidden because the mechanisms for detection have not evolved, have not been developed, have not been made accessible to awareness. And the awareness that some claim to have, that schizophrenics report, that people experiencing psychosis describe, might not be delusion, but might be the temporary or permanent loss of the shielding, the opening of the channels that are normally closed, the reception of signals that are normally filtered out. And the filtering is what protects privacy, is what keeps thoughts hidden, is what ensures that consciousness remains internal, but the internal might not be as secure as it seems, might not be as absolute as is assumed, might be vulnerable to detection, to interception, to the kind of broadcasting that paranoid individuals fear, and that psychiatric diagnosis dismisses as impossible, as symptom, as the misattribution of internal events to external sources. But what if the misattribution is correct? What if the internal events are external? What if thoughts are not confined to the skull, but are radiating outward on frequencies that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some cannot avoid detecting, and the detecting is experienced as hearing voices, as receiving transmissions, as being unable to stop the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, but are coming from others, from the environment, from the field of consciousness that might be shared rather than private, that might be collective rather than individual, that might be accessible to those whose shielding has failed, whose filters have broken, whose sensitivity has increased beyond the normal range. And the normal range is what most people experience, is the condition where thoughts feel private, feel internal, feel like they belong to the self and are not accessible to others. But this feeling might be illusion, might be the result of limited sensitivity, might be the consequence of biological constraints that prevent the detection of signals that are actually present, actually broadcasting, actually available to anyone with the right equipment, the right sensitivity, the right frequency. And the frequency is what matters, is what determines whether thoughts are visible or invisible, whether consciousness is private or public, whether the mind is sealed or permeable. And the permeable is what some experience, is what schizophrenics describe, is what people in psychosis report. And the reports are consistent, are describing the same phenomena across cultures, across time periods, across individuals who have no contact with each other. And the consistency is troubling, is suggesting that maybe the experiences are not entirely subjective, are not entirely generated by malfunctioning brains, but are detecting something real, something that is normally filtered out, something that exists in the environment, in the field, in the frequencies where consciousness operates. And the operating might be electromagnetic, might be quantum, might be something that physics has not yet characterized, but that biology is sensitive to, that nervous systems are tuned to, that brains are receiving and transmitting constantly. And the transmitting is what creates the possibility of thought broadcasting, is what makes privacy contingent rather than absolute, is what suggests that The experience of having thoughts that are one's own, that are hidden from others, that are safe from detection, might be the result of anatomical luck, might be the consequence of having filters that work, having shielding that holds, having a nervous system that is tuned to the right frequency and is not picking up the signals that are all around, that are being broadcast by every other conscious being, and the beings are transmitting without knowing, are radiating thoughts without intending, are creating a field of consciousness that is dense, that is crowded, that is full of signals that most cannot detect, but that some can, that some are cursed to detect, that some experience as invasion, as the loss of privacy, as the horrifying realization that thoughts are not safe, are not hidden, are not private, and the not private is what thought broadcasting delusion describes is what paranoia is responding to, is what might be accurate perception rather than misperception, might be the detection of real signals rather than the hallucination of imaginary ones. And the imaginary is what psychiatry assumes, is what diagnosis requires, is the framework that treats all claims of thought broadcasting as symptoms of disorder, as evidence of psychosis, as the malfunctioning of the reality testing apparatus. But reality testing assumes knowledge of what reality is, assumes that the normal experience is the accurate experience, assumes that privacy is real, and that any perception of its violation is false. And the false might be the assumption, might be the belief that thoughts are private, might be the conviction that consciousness is sealed, when really consciousness is leaking, is broadcasting, is detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what makes some people receivers and others transmitters, and most people neither. Most people shielded, most people operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, that do not allow detection, that maintain the illusion of privacy. And the illusion is functional, is necessary, is what makes social life possible, because if everyone could detect everyone else's thoughts, then interaction would be impossible, would be overwhelming, would be the constant influx of signals that would drown out the ability to think, to focus, to maintain the sense of being an individual consciousness. And the individual is what privacy creates, is what shielding allows, is what makes the experience of being a separate self possible. And the separate might be illusion, might be the result of limited perception, might be what happens when the field of consciousness is filtered down to the signals that originate in one body, in one nervous system, in one brain. And the brain is creating the illusion of separation by filtering out everything else, by attending only to internal signals, by ignoring or suppressing the external signals that are always present, always available, always broadcasting. And the broadcasting is what some cannot ignore, cannot suppress, cannot filter out. And these are the ones who experience thought broadcasting, who hear voices, who feel that their privacy has been violated, and the violation might be real, might be the accurate perception that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not sealed, that the mind is permeable to signals from the environment, from other minds, from the field that connects all consciousness. And the connecting is what thought broadcasting implies, is what the delusion is pointing toward, is the possibility that minds are not isolated but are networked, are not separate but are overlapping, are not private but are accessible to each other on frequencies that most cannot detect. And the detection is what would make privacy impossible, would make thought visible, would make consciousness public. And the public is what some are experiencing, is what some are reporting, is what psychiatry is dismissing as impossible, as symptom, as the product of malfunctioning brains. But what if the brains are not malfunctioning, but are functioning too well, are too sensitive, are detecting signals that are real, but are normally filtered out? And the filtering is what fails in psychosis, is what breaks in schizophrenia, is what allows the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, that are coming from others, that are being broadcast on frequencies that are normally inaccessible, and the inaccessible is what protects privacy, is what makes thoughts feel safe, is what creates the illusion that the mind is sealed, is private, is hidden from others, and the hidden might be temporary, might be contingent, might be the result of biological constraints that could be overcome, could be bypassed, could be eliminated through technology, through drugs, through practices that alter consciousness, that change sensitivity, that open the channels that are normally closed. And the opening is what some experience spontaneously, is what happens in psychosis, is what occurs when the filters fail. And the failing might not be pathological, but might be the revealing of a truth that is normally hidden, that is normally suppressed, that is incompatible with social functioning, but is accurate, is real, is showing that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not individual, that the mind is part of a field that is shared, that is collective, that is accessible to anyone who has the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what determines whether thoughts are experienced as private or as public, as hidden or as visible, as safe or as vulnerable. And the vulnerable is what thought broadcasting feels like, is what the experience is the sense that privacy has been lost, that thoughts are exposed, that the mind is transparent to others. And the transparency might be real, might be accurate, might be the perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer hidden, where the illusion of privacy dissolves, and the dissolving is terrifying, is overwhelming, is experienced as invasion, as violation, as the loss of the boundary that makes the self feel separate, feel protected, feel safe. And the safety is what privacy provides, is what shielding creates, is what most people have and some people lack. And the lacking is what makes thought broadcasting possible, is what opens the channels, is what allows detection. And the detection is not imagined, but is real, is accurate, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting, that are coming from other minds. And the other minds are not aware that they are broadcasting, are not intending to transmit, are not trying to communicate, are just existing, just thinking, just being conscious. And the consciousness is radiating, is emitting signals, is creating a field that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some experience as voices, as thoughts that are not their own, as the influx of consciousness from outside, and the outside is everywhere, is surrounding, is the environment of minds that are all broadcasting, all transmitting, all creating signals that are normally filtered out, but that some can detect. And the detecting is what schizophrenics are doing, is what people in psychosis are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is. And the broadcasting is real, is not delusion, is not symptom, is the accurate perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is detectable, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what some report, is what psychiatry dismisses. But the dismissing might be wrong, might be the refusal to acknowledge a truth that is too disturbing, too threatening, too incompatible with the belief that thoughts are private, that minds are sealed, that consciousness is individual, and the individual might be illusion, might be the result of shielding, might be what most people experience because their filters work, because their sensitivity is limited, because they are operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, and the others are there, are broadcasting, are detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what the Soviets were researching, is what psychic warfare experiments were trying to exploit, is what programs like M-Cultura were investigating, is the possibility that thoughts can be detected, can be influenced, can be transmitted and received. And the receiving is what some can do naturally, is what schizophrenics are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is describing, and the describing is accurate, is real, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting on frequencies that are normally inaccessible. And the inaccessible is what protects most people, is what maintains privacy, is what creates the illusion that thoughts are hidden, are safe, are private, but the private is contingent, is anatomical, is the result of luck, of having the right sensitivity, the right filters, the right shielding, and the shielding can fail, can break, can be bypassed, and the bypassing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are not private, consciousness is not sealed, minds are not isolated, and the isolation is illusion, is the result of limited perception, is what happens when the frequencies where consciousness operates are filtered out, are suppressed, are made inaccessible, and the inaccessible is temporary, is contingent, is what most people experience, but not what everyone experiences. And the everyone includes those who can detect the signals, who can perceive the thoughts, who can see consciousness at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the mind is exposed, and the exposed is what thought broadcasting is what the experience describes, is what some are perceiving, and the perceiving might be accurate, might be real, might be showing that privacy is not fundamental, but is contingent, is not absolute, but is anatomical, is not guaranteed, but is the result of luck, of having filters that work, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap, of being shielded from the signals that are everywhere, that are broadcasting, that are making thoughts visible to those who can detect them, and the detecting is possible, is real, is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is, and the broadcasting is not delusion, but is perception, is not symptom, but is sensitivity, is not pathology, but is the revealing of a truth that most cannot see, that most are protected from, that most never experience, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not inherent, but is anatomical luck, is the contingent result of having the right biology, the right sensitivity, the right shielding, and the shielding is what fails, is what breaks, is what allows the frequency where thoughts become visible to be detected, to be experienced, to be known. And the knowing is terrifying, is overwhelming, is the loss of the illusion that made privacy possible, that made the self feel separate, that made consciousness feel safe. And the safety is gone, is lost, is revealed to be illusion, is shown to be contingent, is exposed as anatomical luck, and the luck is what most have, is what protects most people, is what maintains the belief that thoughts are private. But the private is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is not fundamental, is only the result of frequencies being filtered, being suppressed, being made inaccessible, and the inaccessible can become accessible, can be detected, can be experienced, and the experiencing is what thought broadcasting is what schizophrenics report, is what psychosis reveals, which is that privacy is not inherent, consciousness is not sealed, thoughts are not hidden, and the hidden is illusion, is the result of shielding, is the contingent outcome of anatomical luck, and the luck can fail, can run out, can be lost, and the losing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, minds are permeable, consciousness is detectable at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the illusion ends, and the ending is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the perception of the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is revealed to be not fundamental, but contingent, not absolute, but anatomical, not guaranteed, but luck. And the luck is what protects most, is what fails for some, is what reveals the truth that thoughts are broadcasting, are visible, are detectable, and the detecting is real, is accurate, is not delusion, but perception, is not symptom, but sensitivity, is not pathology, but truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer private, where the mind is exposed and the exposure is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, is contingent, is not absolute, is not fundamental, is only the result of filtering, of shielding, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap, and the overlapping is what happens when the filters fail, when the shielding breaks, when the frequency becomes accessible. And the accessible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the visibility of thoughts, the detectability of consciousness, the permeability of mind. And the permeability is real, is accurate, is the truth that privacy is not inherent but is luck, is not absolute but is anatomical, is not guaranteed but is contingent. And the contingent can fail, can end, can reveal the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that minds are permeable, that thoughts are visible, that consciousness operates on frequencies that some can detect. And the detecting is not delusion, is not symptom, is not pathology, is perception, is sensitivity, is the revealing of truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where privacy ends, where the illusion dissolves. And the dissolving is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, and luck can fail, and the failing reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not fundamental, is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is only luck, is only shielding, is only the filtering of frequencies where thoughts become visible. And the visible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that privacy is contingent, is anatomical, is luck. The Buddhists arrived at similar conclusions through a different route, through meditation rather than metaphysics, through direct observation of the mind rather than philosophical system building. And the first noble truth of Buddhism is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately rendered as unsatisfactoriness, as the pervasive quality of experience being not quite right, not quite enough, always slightly off. And dukkha is not just pain in the obvious sense, not just sickness and aging and death, though it includes those, but also the subtler suffering that pervades even pleasant experiences. The suffering of impermanence, the knowledge that this good thing will end, the clinging to what is passing, the aversion to what is arriving. And the Buddha taught that dukkha arises from tanha, from craving, from thirst, from the insatiable wanting that drives all beings. And this wanting takes three forms: wanting to get pleasant experiences, wanting to get rid of unpleasant experiences, and wanting to exist or not exist, to be or not to be. And all three forms are doomed to frustration because pleasant experiences are temporary, unpleasant experiences are inevitable, and existence itself is impermanent. And so the structure of suffering is built into the structure of desire, is unavoidable as long as desire persists. And the path to liberation is not through satisfying desire, which is impossible, but through extinguishing desire, through seeing clearly that the objects of desire are empty, are incapable of providing lasting satisfaction. And through this seeing, the craving naturally falls away, naturally releases its grip, and what remains is peace, is nirvana, is the end of suffering. But this end is not a state of pleasure, is not happiness in the ordinary sense, is more like the absence of disturbance, the cessation of the constant churning that characterizes normal consciousness. And the question is whether this cessation is desirable, whether a life without desire is a life worth living, whether the price of ending suffering is too high if it requires giving up the very things that make life feel meaningful, the projects and relationships and ambitions that depend on caring about outcomes, on wanting things to be a certain way. And different Buddhist traditions answer this question differently, some emphasizing renunciation and withdrawal, others emphasizing engagement and compassion, but all agree that the root problem is structural, is in the nature of consciousness itself, is not something that can be fixed through better circumstances or better choices, but only through a fundamental transformation of how experience is related to, how the self is understood, how the mind works. Modern psychology has discovered what it calls hedonic adaptation, the process by which humans return to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of changes in life circumstances. And the research shows that people who win the lottery, after an initial spike of euphoria, return within months to approximately the same level of life satisfaction they had before winning. And people who become paralyzed after the initial devastation adapt and return to a level of happiness that is lower than before, but not as low as would be predicted. Not as low as most people imagine it would be. And this adaptation is a survival mechanism. It is necessary because if organisms could be permanently satisfied by achieving a goal, then they would stop striving, would stop seeking food and mates and safety, and would not survive. And so the brain is built to habituate, to normalize, to take whatever is and make it the new baseline. And this means that the pursuit of happiness, through achievement, through acquisition, through changing external circumstances, is structurally doomed, is chasing a horizon that recedes at the same rate it is approached, because the happiness is not in the circumstances, but in the change, in the contrast, in the movement from worse to better. And once the better becomes normal, it is no longer better. It is just the new normal, and new desires emerge, new dissatisfactions appear, and the hedonic treadmill keeps turning, keeps demanding more effort to stay in the same place. And the only ones who escape this treadmill are those who stop running, who step off, who find a way to want what they have rather than having what they want. But this stepping off is difficult, is counter to every instinct, is fighting against the architecture that makes humans what they are, and most people never manage it, spend entire lives running and never arriving, and die still wanting, still believing that the next thing will be the thing that finally brings peace. And this belief is necessary for the machinery to function, is the fuel that keeps the engine running. And natural selection has no interest in whether organisms are happy, only in whether they reproduce. And happiness is useful only insofar as it motivates behavior that leads to reproduction. And beyond that utility, it is irrelevant, is waste, is not optimized for. And so the baseline is set low, is set to chronic mild dissatisfaction, because that is what motivates, what drives action, what keeps organisms alive long enough to pass genes forward. The problem of evil has troubled theologians for millennia. The question of how a benevolent and omnipotent God could allow suffering to exist. And the traditional answers involve free will, involve the necessity of moral growth through adversity, involve the incomprehensibility of divine plans. But these answers satisfy fewer and fewer people as the scale of suffering becomes visible, as the recognition spreads that most suffering is not ennobling, does not lead to growth, does not serve any purpose that a benevolent designer would endorse, that children die of disease, that animals are eaten alive, that entire populations are wiped out by earthquakes and floods and famines that have nothing to do with human choice, nothing to do with moral development, nothing to do with anything except the cold mechanics of a universe that is indifferent to pain. And the philosopher David Hume argued that the presence of suffering is evidence against the existence of a benevolent God, that no parent would design a world like this for their children, that the amount and distribution of pain suggests either that there is no designer or that the designer is not good, is not worthy of worship. And Hume's argument has never been adequately answered, has only been evaded through appeals to mystery, through claims that human reason is insufficient to judge divine purposes. But this evasion is itself an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the problem is real and the reconciliation is impossible. And so the theological framework collapses under the weight of suffering, leaves only the question of how to bear existence without the consolation of cosmic justice, without the belief that pain serves a purpose, without the hope that somewhere, somehow, the scales will balance and the answer might be that there is no answer, that suffering does not mean anything, does not point toward anything, is just the cost of nervous systems, the price of being organized in a way that allows for sensation, And that consciousness, that awareness of the gap between what is and what could be, amplifies this suffering, makes it not just physical, but existential. Not just sensation, but meaning. Not just pain, but the knowledge of pain, the memory of pain, the anticipation of future pain. And this knowledge makes human suffering unique, makes it worse than animal suffering. Not because the pain is more intense, but because it is reflected upon, is integrated into narrative, becomes part of identity, becomes something that the self must carry and interpret and explain. And the explanations are usually lies, are usually stories about deserving or learning or cosmic balance. And these lies are necessary, are what make continued existence tolerable. But they are still lies, and occasionally the lies fail. Occasionally the truth breaks through. And what is seen in those moments is the naked architecture, the structure of suffering that underlies everything. And this seeing is what mystics call enlightenment, and what others call depression. And perhaps these are not opposites, but the same recognition, interpreted through different frameworks, the same glimpse of the machinery, with different conclusions about what to do with the knowledge. Schopenhauer believed that the only legitimate response to this recognition is compassion, because once it is understood that all beings are expressions of the same will, that suffering is universal, that the appearance of separation between self and other is illusion, then harming another is revealed to be harming oneself. And the natural response is to minimize suffering wherever possible, to extend kindness not because it will be rewarded, but because the boundaries between beings are not as solid as they appear. And this compassion is not sentimental, is not based on hope or optimism, is based on the clear-eyed recognition that existence is shared burden, that everyone is trapped in the same machinery, and that the only response that makes sense is to reduce the load where possible, to offer relief where available, to acknowledge the suffering rather than deny it. And Schopenhauer saw art and philosophy as temporary escapes, as moments where the will is briefly quieted, where awareness can contemplate form without desire, can appreciate beauty without wanting to possess it, can think about truth without needing to use it. And these moments are rare, are fragile, are always interrupted by the return of willing, but they offer proof that another mode of existence is possible, that the machinery can be paused, that the architecture of suffering does not have to be the only architecture, even if it is the dominant one, even if it is the one that shapes most of life, most of the time. And the question is whether these moments justify the rest, whether the brief respites are worth the long stretches of striving and failing and suffering. And Schopenhauer himself was unsure, oscillated between affirmation and negation, between the beauty of the world and the horror of the world. And perhaps this oscillation is the only honest response, the only way to hold both truths simultaneously, that life is terrible and life is precious, that suffering is structural and moments of peace are real, that the architecture cannot be dismantled, but occasionally there are rooms within it where the walls fall away and something else becomes visible, something that is not suffering, not pleasure, but simply presence, simply the fact of being without the overlay, of wanting or not wanting. And these moments do not solve the problem, do not justify the design, but they complicate it, make it less simple than pure pessimism would suggest, make it possible to continue even without hope, even without the belief that things will get better. Because better is not the point. The point is just this, just the strange fact of consciousness, of awareness watching itself struggle, and occasionally, inexplicably, finding in that struggle something that cannot quite be called good, but also cannot be called entirely bad, something that is just what it is, just the texture of existence itself, neither endorsed nor rejected, but simply witnessed. And in that witnessing, there is a kind of freedom. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom within it. Freedom to see it clearly, to understand the architecture, to know the machinery, and to choose not whether to suffer, because that is not a choice, but how to suffer. With resistance or acceptance, with bitterness or grace, with isolation or connection. And these choices do not change the structure, but they change the experience of living within the structure. And perhaps that is all that can be changed. Perhaps that is enough. Or perhaps it is not enough. Perhaps nothing is enough. Perhaps the architecture guarantees that enough will never arrive, that satisfaction will always be temporary, that the next moment will bring new wanting, new suffering, new proof that the baseline cannot be permanently altered. And this might be the final truth, the one that cannot be evaded or consoled, that existence is structured to hurt, that pain is not accidental but essential, and that knowing this changes nothing except the quality of the knowing, makes it possible to stop searching for the exit that does not exist, stop believing in solutions that cannot work, stop hoping for permanent peace in a system designed for permanent striving, and to simply live, to simply continue. Not because it is good, but because it is what is happening, because the alternative is non-existence, and that carries its own kind of terror, its own questions about whether the absence of suffering justifies the absence of everything else, whether zero is better than negative, whether non-being is preferable to painful being. And most people, most of the time, choose painful being, choose to continue even when continuation is difficult, even when the architecture presses down, even when suffering is overwhelming. And this choice is not rational, is not based on calculation, is based on something deeper, something prior to reasons, something in the will itself that says yes to life even when life says no to the will, even when existence denies what existence most wants, which is rest, which is peace, which is the end of striving, but the striving cannot end while there is life. And so the circle closes, the architecture holds, the structure of suffering remains intact, and consciousness continues to move through it, continues to experience the gap between what is and what's wanted, continues to suffer, not because something is wrong, but because everything is exactly as it must be, exactly as the machinery dictates. And there is no escape except through the one door that ends all doors, the one exit that is final, and most hesitate at that threshold, turn back toward the architecture, toward the suffering they know, because the unknown might be worse or might be nothing, and nothing is difficult to choose when something, even painful something, is the only thing that has ever been experienced, is the only thing that consciousness knows how to be. Meaning was not invented but was given, was not constructed but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced, not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there, and the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. and the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option, and without grounding the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different, and what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm, and the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values. And so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen, and choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity. The flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story, and what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not, many cannot, many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not, and the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Memory is not a gift, but a burden. Not the preservation of experience, but its prolongation. Not the recording of the past, but its endless present tense replay. And this replay is what makes trauma permanent, what makes suffering extend beyond its moment. What converts a single event into a lifetime of pain, because the event is not just remembered, but is relived, it is re-experienced in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of activation that do not distinguish between then and now, between memory and occurrence, between representation and reality, and so the past remains present, remains active, remains capable of causing suffering long after the original threat has passed, long after the danger is over, long after any adaptive function of remembering could be served. And this persistence raises the question of whether some memories should be erased, whether some experiences should be forgotten, whether the technology that is emerging that promises to selectively delete traumatic memories while leaving other memories intact should be used, should be embraced, should be offered to those whose lives are destroyed by memories. They cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive, and the survival is what is at stake, is what makes the question urgent. Because some memories are incompatible with living, are producing symptoms that are unbearable, are creating suffering so severe that the person carrying the memory would choose non-existence over continued remembering. And the choices being made is visible in suicide rates, in substance abuse, in all the ways that people try to escape memories that will not let them go. And the letting go is what forgetting would provide, is what erasure would accomplish, is the liberation from the past that therapy tries to achieve, but often fails to deliver. Because therapy works with memory, works through memory, tries to integrate the traumatic experience into narrative, into meaning, into the story of the self. But some experiences resist integration, resist meaning, resist becoming part of any story except the story of horror, of violation, of the destruction of everything that makes life livable. And when integration fails, when meaning cannot be found, when the memory remains as intrusive, as overwhelming, as fragmenting as it was at the moment of encoding, then what is the ethical response? Is it to insist that the person continue carrying the memory, continue suffering from it, continue being destroyed by it? Or is it to offer erasure, to provide the technology that could remove the memory, could delete the trace, could free the person from the past? And the freedom is what erasure promises, is what makes it appealing, is what drives the development of techniques that can target specific memories, that can identify the neural patterns associated with traumatic experiences and disrupt them, prevent them from reconsolidating, make them inaccessible. And the inaccessibility is forgetting, is the functional equivalent of the memory never having been formed. And if the memory was never formed, then the trauma never happened. Not in the sense that the event did not occur, but in the sense that it is not remembered, is not present, is not continuing to shape experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if the influence is removed, then the past is effectively erased, is no longer part of the person's life, is no longer determining their responses, their possibilities, their sense of who they are. And the who they are is the problem, is the question that erasure raises. Because if identity is constituted by memory, if the self is the narrative constructed from experiences, then what happens to identity when memories are deleted, when experiences are removed, when the continuity is broken? And the continuity is what makes the self feel stable, feel coherent, feel like the same person over time. And if memories are erased, then the person who emerges is not the same person, is someone different, is someone who did not have those experiences, who was not shaped by that trauma, who does not carry that pain. And this difference is what makes erasure controversial, is what raises the ethical question of whether it is right to change someone's identity, to make them into someone else, even if that someone else would suffer less, would function better, would have a life that is livable. Because the life that is livable is not the life of the person who chose erasure, is the life of a different person, a person who is created by the deletion of memory. And creation through deletion is strange, is unsettling, is raising questions about what it means to be the same person, what continuity consists of, what identity requires, and the requirements are not clear, are disputed, are the subject of philosophical debate that has no resolution. Because some theories say that identity requires psychological continuity, requires that there be a chain of memories connecting present self to past self. And if that chain is broken, if memories are deleted, then continuity is lost, identity is disrupted. The person who exists after erasure is not the same person who existed before, and this non-sameness is either a problem or a solution depending on perspective, depending on whether identity is valued more than well-being, whether continuity is more important than happiness, whether the integrity of the self matters more than the quality of experience, and the quality of experience is what suffers under traumatic memory, is what is destroyed by intrusive recollections, is what makes life unbearable for those who cannot forget. And if they cannot forget naturally, then perhaps they should be allowed to forget artificially, to choose erasure, to opt for the deletion of memories that are destroying them. And the destruction is real, is measurable, is visible in brain scans, in stress hormone levels, in all the biomarkers of chronic suffering. And the suffering is not ennobling, is not making people stronger, is not serving any purpose except to demonstrate that memory can be prison, can be torture, can be the mechanism through which the past destroys the present. And the destruction is what erasure would prevent, is what deletion would stop, is what forgetting would accomplish. And the accomplishing is mercy, is compassion, is the recognition that some memories are too heavy to carry, are too painful to bear, are incompatible with survival, and survival is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what justifies intervention, justifies technology, justifies the manipulation of memory that would once have been considered impossible, unthinkable, unethical, but is now possible, is now real, is now raising questions that must be answered about who decides, about what criteria are used, about whether erasure should be available to anyone who wants it or only to those whose suffering meets some threshold. And the threshold is where the difficulty lies, is where the ethics become complicated, because if erasure is available only for the most severe trauma, then who decides what counts as severe enough? And if it is available to anyone, then what prevents its misuse? What prevents people from erasing memories that are uncomfortable but not traumatic, that are painful but not disabling, that are part of the normal range of human experience and should perhaps be integrated rather than deleted? And the integration is what traditional approaches emphasize, is what therapy aims for, is the incorporation of difficult experiences into a coherent narrative, into a sense of self that includes the trauma but is not defined by it. But this incorporation is not always possible, is not always achievable, is requiring resources and time and capacity that not everyone has. And even when it is achieved, it is not always sufficient, is not always eliminating the suffering, is not always making the memory tolerable. And when integration fails, then what? Is the person simply condemned to suffer? Condemned to carry the memory forever? Condemned to be destroyed by an experience that happened once but is replaying endlessly? And the endless is what memory makes possible, is the way that a single event can become a lifetime of suffering. And if that suffering can be prevented, can be eliminated, can be stopped through the deletion of memory, then why should it not be? What principle is more important than the relief of suffering? What value trumps the well-being of the person who is being destroyed by memory? And the destruction is not metaphorical, is literal, is the disintegration of functioning, of relationships, of the capacity to live. And if erasure can prevent this disintegration, then perhaps it should be used. Perhaps it should be offered. Perhaps it should be normalized rather than stigmatized. But the stigma is real, is coming from multiple directions, from those who believe that memory is essential to identity and should not be tampered with, from those who worry about slippery slopes and unintended consequences, from those who insist that suffering has meaning and should be endured rather than erased. And the meaning is what is most disputed, is what is most questioned. Because the claim that suffering has meaning is easy to make from a position of safety, from a position of not suffering, from a position of having integrated one's own traumas, or never having experienced trauma severe enough to be unintegrable. But for those who are suffering, for those who are being destroyed. The meaning is not visible, is not accessible, is not providing any comfort or purpose or reason to continue. And the continue is what is in question, is what is at stake, is why erasure might be necessary, might be ethical, might be the right choice. Despite all the concerns about identity and continuity and the sanctity of memory, because memory is not sacred, is not inherently valuable, is only valuable insofar as it serves life. And when it does not serve life, when it destroys life, when it makes life unbearable, then its value is negative, is harmful, is justifying intervention. And intervention is what erasure is the technological manipulation of memory for therapeutic purposes. And the therapeutic is what justifies it, is what makes it ethical, is the goal of reducing suffering, of improving functioning, of making life livable for those for whom it is currently unlivable. And the unlivable is the condition that justifies extreme measures, that justifies technologies that would otherwise be considered too risky, too invasive, too potentially harmful, because the harm of doing nothing is greater than the harm of erasure, is greater than the risk of identity disruption, is greater than any abstract concern about the sanctity of memory. And the sanctity is the appeal to tradition, is the insistence that things should be done the way they have always been done, that memory should not be manipulated, that the past should be accepted rather than edited. But this traditionalism is not serving those who are suffering, is not helping those who are being destroyed, is only protecting an ideal, a concept, a belief that memory is essential to being human. And maybe it is, maybe memory is what makes humans human, but maybe humans would be better off with less memory, with more forgetting, with the capacity to let go of experiences that serve no purpose except to create suffering. And the capacity is what technology is providing, is what erasure makes possible, is the choice to forget, to let go, to be free from the past. And the freedom is what matters, is what should be prioritized, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but perhaps obligatory, perhaps something that should be offered, should be encouraged, should be made available to all who need it, because the need is great, is widespread, is affecting millions who are living with memories they cannot escape, cannot integrate, cannot survive. And the survival is what is at stake, is what makes this an urgent question. Not an abstract philosophical puzzle, but a practical ethical dilemma with real consequences for real people who are suffering now, who need relief now, who cannot wait for therapy to work or for time to heal or for meaning to emerge from their trauma. Because for many, the meaning never emerges. The healing never happens. The suffering never ends, except through death or erasure. And if erasure can prevent death, then it is the ethical choice, is the compassionate choice, is the choice that prioritizes the person over the principle, the individual over the ideal, the actual suffering over the abstract concern. And the concern about identity is legitimate, is real, is raising important questions about what continuity means and whether it can be preserved through erasure. But these questions are secondary to the question of survival, are less urgent than the question of whether the person can continue living with the memory. And if they cannot, then the questions about identity become moot, become irrelevant, because identity requires existence, and existence requires tolerability, and tolerability requires that memory not be destroying the person. And if it is destroying the person, then erasure is justified, is necessary, is the intervention that should be used. And the using is not a failure of courage or resilience or meaning-making, is not an admission of weakness, is not a refusal to integrate or endure, is simply the recognition that some experiences are too much, are beyond what can be borne, are incompatible with living. And when living is the goal, then erasure is the means, is the technology that makes it possible, is the mercy that medicine can provide. And the providing is ethics, is compassion, is the appropriate response to suffering that is otherwise unrelievable. And the unrelievable is what makes memory torture in some cases, is what makes the past a prison, is what makes forgetting not a failure, but a necessity, not a loss, but a gain, not the destruction of identity, but its salvation, because identity requires a living person, and living requires that trauma not be replaying constantly, not be fragmenting consciousness, not be making every moment unbearable. And the unbearable is what memory makes possible, is what remembering produces is the cost of consciousness that includes memory, and maybe some things should not be remembered, should not be preserved, should not be allowed to continue shaping experience. And the shaping is what memory does, is how the past influences the present. And if that influence is destructive, then it should be stopped, should be interrupted, should be erased. And the erasing is what technology now allows, is what ethics should permit, is what compassion demands. Because the alternative is continued suffering, is the ongoing destruction of people by their own memories, is the insistence that they carry burdens that no one should have to carry, that serve no purpose, that make no meaning, that produce only pain, and the pain is enough, is sufficient reason to intervene, is justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the liberation from memory that is prison, that is torture. That is the mechanism through which trauma becomes permanent. And the permanent is what should be ended, is what technology can end, is what ethics should permit ending. Because memory is not sacred, identity is not absolute, continuity is not more important than survival, and survival is what erasure makes possible, is what forgetting provides, is what some people need in order to live. And the living is what matters, is what should be protected, is what justifies the technology, justifies the intervention, justifies the choice to erase, to forget, to let go of the past, to be freed from memory, to be given the mercy of amnesia. And the mercy is real, is powerful, is the gift of forgetting what should never have happened, what should never have been remembered, what should never have been allowed to destroy a life. And the destruction is what erasure prevents, is what forgetting stops, is what makes the ethics clear, makes the choice obvious, makes the answer yes. Some memories should be erased, should be deleted, should be forgotten, because memory is not always gift, is sometimes curse, is sometimes the thing that destroys rather than preserves, that harms rather than helps, that makes life unbearable rather than meaningful. And when memory is cursed, then erasure is cure, is treatment, is the ethical response to suffering that has no other solution. And the solution is forgetting, is amnesia, is the right to oblivion, is the choice to let the past go, to be freed from its weight, to live without the burden of memories that serve no purpose except to create pain. And the pain is enough, is reason enough, is justification enough for erasure, for deletion, for the technology that makes forgetting possible, that makes mercy achievable, that makes liberation from memory real. And the real is what matters, is what should guide ethics, is what should determine whether erasure is used. And the determination is clear, is obvious, is yes, for those who need it, for those who are suffering, for those whose memories are destroying them. Erasure should be available, should be offered, should be used, because memory is not sacred, suffering is not meaningful. The past is not worth preserving when it destroys the present, and the present is all there is all that matters, is what should be protected, even if protection requires forgetting, even if survival requires erasure, even if living requires the deletion of memory, because living is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes erasure not just permissible, but necessary, not just acceptable, but obligatory, not just an option, but the right choice, the ethical choice, the compassionate choice, the choice that prioritizes people over principles, individuals over ideals, actual lives over abstract concerns. And the concerns are real, but are secondary, are less important than the suffering, less urgent than the need, less compelling than the possibility of relief. And the relief is what erasure provides, is what forgetting offers, is what amnesia delivers, and the delivery is mercy, is compassion, is ethics in action, is the appropriate response to suffering that can be prevented, to pain that can be stopped, to memories that can be erased, and should be erased, and will be erased, because the technology exists, because the need is real, because the suffering is unbearable, and the unbearable should not be borne when it can be lifted, when it can be removed, when it can be erased. And the erasing is not loss but gain, not harm but healing, not destruction but salvation, not the end of identity but its continuation. Because identity requires life, and life requires that memory not be weapon, not be prison, not be torture. And when memory is these things, then erasure is the answer, is the solution, is the mercy that makes. Living possible, and the possible, is what matters, is what ethics serves, is what makes forgetting not failure, but wisdom, not weakness, but strength, not escape, but survival. And survival is enough, is sufficient, is the justification for erasure, for deletion, for the right to forget, for the mercy of amnesia, for the ethics of forgetting.